Hey everybody, Pete Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. I think you're going to love today's episode. A returning guest, third time, David Daley, who wrote the book... Ratfucked. I wasn't sure if I was going to say it, but why not? That is actually the name of the book, Ratfucked. And then his next book was called UnRigged. And what these books examine are gerrymandering and how our political system, just before we even get going, is designed to take our power away and give it to politicians. Whether or not it's Republicans or Democrats or just a conglomerate of politicians saying, we want to control the districting process. You know, this goes back as long as we've had voting, but in particular, this version of what David's talking about goes back to 2010 when Republicans realized, we may not be competitive for the presidency because it's a non-presidential year in 2010, but we can win these state legislatures. And guess who draws the lines on the maps for districting for the U.S. House of Representatives? That's right, the state legislatures. So now that we're here in 2020, again, the Democrats go, hey, we're going for the big ticket. We're going for Joe Biden. But the Republicans are like, we're going to lock down. They already have this advantage because they already did this in 2010. Now they've done it again in 2020. And so while we're all looking at the top of the bout, not looking at the bottom, and the state legislation grasp goes towards the Republicans. And so these machines are fighting each other the whole time. We're having our rights removed. I mean, who you vote for and who represents you. These things are maddening. I mean, it's just maddening. Anyhow, and this is not a right or left leaning show. It's just about like, if we're going to, and you'll hear Will Reilly, who's, on the show all the time as a political scientist, Dave Daley. These guys probably don't agree politically, but they agree on the lack of democratic forms of voting. And so I think you're going to enjoy that part of it. Hey, a couple things real quick. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. You can always click on the donation tab at the website and put a little money in the coffers. It is the giving season. We appreciate any support you can give us. The other thing I want to say is we gave away the rifle from the raffle. And so we raised a bunch of money, I think over $10,000 for that. That all goes back to the Ride for the Brave that we did this summer. So that rifle was given away. I'll have to get the name of the person. It escapes me right now while I sit in the tent and record this intro. But the main thing I wanted to get across to you all is I really appreciate you guys coming through on the Save the Brave part. And I really appreciate everybody who's done a great job with that. We continue to lean on this. And let me tell you something. Save the Brave has had a great year. One of the things John and I were talking about, he's like, how's it going over there at Save the Brave? And I'm like, look, we have more heads for more hats. We're not all multi-hatting with 15 hats. We're getting heads for hats. And that's a great sign that the charity is growing and doing well. Okay, that's about it. I want you guys all to have a great week. Here comes David Daley.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is David Daley, and you're watching The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Man, I love having you on because, well, one, you're a cool dude, and I always love chatting with you. And it makes me smile to have people on the show from a variety of backgrounds and political inclinations. You used to be the editor-in-chief at Salon, but we can have a reasonable conversation, which is, I think these things they're not as precious as we believe, but they're awfully precious on the internet, So I always like to savor opportunities to bring multiple perspectives to the show. And one of the things that you and I both believe in is like truly, without party consideration, preserving democracy, making sure people's votes matter. And there's less disenfranchisement, but that gets politicized as soon as you say that, So like I'm curious what your thoughts are on the balance in general between voter enfranchisement and then the security of an election, because we've got this fight right now going on. We've compromised the integrity of the election, right or wrong, left or right, but we have less faith in it. No matter who wins, tens of millions of people are going to be pissed off, right? So how do we balance that scale, man?
I think it's one thing to be pissed off because your side wins or loses an election. It's another to not have belief that the election was fair. And the problem is that we keep talking about rigged elections or irregularities, and Trump isn't able to actually produce any of these irregularities. He's something like 1 for 25 in court now since the election.
Yeah.
And so he likes to talk a lot about fake news. You know, voter fraud is essentially fake news. It is insanely rare. It's being hit by lightning. There is a man at the Heritage Foundation named Hans von Spakovsky, who's one of the leading advancers of the conservative voter fraud argument, and he keeps a database going back to like the early 1980s, I believe, of every case he's been able to document. And over that time, I believe there's something like 1,700 examples in his database. So if you multiply that out across the number of years divided against the hundreds of millions, if not billions of votes that have been cast since then, it is, it's a pebble in the ocean, especially compared to the amount of time that we spend talking about it. Our elections are administered in a safe and secure and nonpartisan way. Now, what partisans try to do to manipulate that process is something else entirely, and we ought to talk about that. But can we have faith in the results? Yes, I think we can absolutely have faith that the results have been accurately tabulated.
Okay, so and then here comes Will. Let me push back on you with this then. So when we see, thousands of votes, historic levels of votes being missed, not counted in Georgia, when we look back in time and when the left doesn't do well, they have the same claims. We've seen tweets from Hillary Clinton, we've seen tweets from Nancy Pelosi, and they all make similar claims like the election was stolen. It's social media, so got it. But we all do this, right? Both sides shout about the election being stolen. And one of the things I've learned, Dave, and I've said this a lot on the show, is that the specter is always worse than the actual threat. And this is what you're saying, basically. Yes, there's some impropriety. Yes, there are people that act individually because, law be damned, I'm going to do this. But is there a problem with security in elections? And, there is a lot of smoke. Always. There's always a lot of smoke. I mean, like this, and it's one instance, but this wrestler who's like, I live in Tennessee. I did not vote in Nevada or Arizona, wherever it was. But sure enough, he voted, So we have these things that indicate that, hey, maybe there is a bigger problem. Does this worry you at all in general without party affiliation?
I look at the numbers out of Oregon or the numbers out of Utah and these Washington State, these states that have been doing vote by mail for a long, long time. And there's a handful out of the tens of millions of ballots that end up being investigated and looked into. And so the amount of smoke compared to the amount of fire, I think, is disproportionate. Welcome to the show, Will.
Hey, yeah, good to be on here with both of you guys. I didn't find the StreamYard invite in my inbox until you resent it on Twitter. But
it's all good.
Good to be here.
We were just talking about the general balance between vote integrity versus franchise, and then when we change this, what do we do to ensure that we're actually how do you balance the scale? What are your thoughts as a political scientist? How do you balance enfranchisement and integrity of an election? Because these are very different things in a lot of ways.
I actually think there's some specific answers here. Like Pete, you and I have talked about this before. And David, I've actually read some of your writing. When you look at voter fraud, first of all, it's absolutely accurate to say that in a typical year, there are 20, 30 actual prosecuted cases of voter fraud. I mean, that's not a massive amount. The response to that, though, from a lot of conservative political scientists would be, in a typical year, there are only about 60 or 70 people arrested for, say, music or movie piracy. The last time I was on the Pirate Bay, there were, not to do anything illegal, of course, there were 27 million active users. The reality is that if you're going to do that, you're probably aware of what a VPN is. You're probably aware of what Tor is. You're not going to make a stupid mistake and get caught. In most cases, that's a civil offense. So it's meaningless to say, well, there are only 70 of these cases. With voter fraud, I think we don't really know. I think that there are virtually no people, Republicans or Democrats, walking into polling places with sort of a taped on bandito mustache and trying to vote in two locations. So I think we all agree on that. The issue with voter fraud historically has been, so for example, in Chicago, my mom was an official at the teachers union for a while, and she flatly denied the union in her era ever did this. But the teachers union has long been accused of what's called union slate voting, where you have a roster of everyone who's a member of the union. And when election day comes, you send in junior proxies to vote for those people that are on sabbatical, that are out of town, so on. This has been alleged since the Boss Tweed era. You assume cameras would make that more difficult, of course. But another example might be simply not vetting the motor voter rolls. In many states, including mine, when you go in to get a driver's license, you're automatically registered to vote. Does somebody check on that at a secondary level? For example, in either hard red, mountain counties or in some of the blue or Louisville precincts? I don't know. At least allegedly not. You have the idea of ballot harvesting. I'd be interested in what you guys think about this. I don't know how seriously I take some input from this source, but there's a pretty well-known video of a guy driving around with a car full of about 400 ballots. This is posted to Instagram, where the claim is, I'm going to deliver these to the Omar campaign, and then they do whatever with them. It's untraceable unless you get down to the fingerprint level. So I think that voter fraud of that kind, we don't know the extent, but is certainly doable. Voter fraud on the part of individuals just deciding to vote for someone. Why would you do that? You could vote as yourself. What would your financial gain be? But we've just listed three possible larger in varieties of voter fraud. Does that happen? Probably. The one final thing I'll say about this is there's a distinction between suspicion and evidence. So when Trump says, okay, there was a period allegedly in Detroit or Philadelphia where Republican poll watchers weren't given full access. I've read some of this material. I'd question how accurate that is, but it's a valid claim. Weren't given full access to, observe the ballots. Anything could have happened. There's a difference between saying anything could have happened and saying I can demonstrably show that 91,370 votes were changed by these practices. So I think that a lot of the voter fraud conversation is a speculative conversation rather than a definite one. I would implement some practices like absolute vetting of motor voter. I probably would require a signed photo ID, so on. That would make some of this more difficult. But right now it's accurate to say we don't really know how much of it there is.
Ultimately, when we have Dave on the show, I want to talk about the down ballot stuff because this is why you're a fellow now at FairVote. You're talking about this problem and have been writing about it in your book Ratfucked and the follow-on book where you're a little more positive about it. But when we're sitting here gnashing our teeth about who's going to be president, we've also missed that the Republicans dominate the state legislatures, and that is important. Why?
Well, it's the state legislatures in most places that have the dominant role over redistricting, which we do every 10 years after the census. We redraw every state legislative and congressional line in the country. And the ability to draw those lines is an incredibly powerful, power, if I can be completely inarticulate.
Typical writer.
Exactly, right? Where are my words when I need them? When you have the power to draw these lines, especially these days with the help of the kind of voter data that's available, with the powerful map making software that can be used, you have the power to pick winners and losers for a decade. We've had gerrymandering with us for a long, long time, right? You can trace it all the way back to, Patrick Henry trying to, Ratfuck James Madison out of the very first Congress. As long as we've had politicians, they've tried to steal every advantage that they possibly can along the way. But the maps that have been drawn over the course of the last decade have been fundamentally different in a lot of ways, largely in that they have endured for, a full decade. Oftentimes a gerrymander kind of runs out over the course of a decade. People die or they move or there's a reshuffling of some kind. And what we have really seen is that, especially at the state legislative level in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Florida and Wisconsin and in North Carolina and Michigan, a lot of these states, the maps have been a firewall for Republicans, and that they, a state like Michigan, Democrats have won more votes statewide almost every year, but the precision with which the Democratic voters were packed and cracked into these districts has ensured Republican majority. Same thing in Wisconsin, a lot of states. So Democrats have done the same thing in Maryland and Illinois. And, I think as we head into another redistricting year, we have to be aware that the software is that much stronger, that the partisans have seen the effectiveness of what happened last time around, and we are about to head into a veritable orgy of partisan gerrymandering that I think is bad for the nature of representative democracy. We elect these state legislators and members of Congress to 2-year terms, and we do that for a reason. They shouldn't be able to take a 2-year term and entrench themselves in office for a decade and then feel as if they can be insulated at the ballot box. It's not the way it ought to be.
I was going to let the political scientist ask something. He's smart.
Yeah, in this particular case, I don't really think there's a lot of disagreement when you talk to academics and writers that are not wildly partisan. I mean, I lean slight right myself, but yeah, gerrymandering is extreme. And I will say, as Pete noted, I don't really see a lot of these as one-party issues. I mean, I'm from Chicago, where every 2 to 4 years we pick some Republicans to run against the establishment. They get their 31% of the vote, and they go back to the investment banking sector. I mean, this is definitely not something just Republicans do or just Democrats do. But yeah, gerrymandering is a significant problematic issue. One thing that I will say about this is that I don't think most people understand, although obviously Mr. Daley does, the extent to which this goes on in terms of numerical detail. Yeah. I worked for a couple of summers as a canvas field manager for the Fund for the Public Interest. We were pursuing a gay rights bill, some environmental legislation, one of those college kid jobs. But you'd better believe that we had a breakdown of everyone in these large Chicago neighborhoods, Logan Square, Avondale, house by house, ethnicity, political party if they'd stated it, what they'd given to us in the past. So when we went to the door, the pitch was tailored not at, would you like to support Environment Illinois, but would you be interested in increasing your previous donation of $970 by 15%? Many people pick 15 because of the 15th year of our campaign to save the lake, yada, yada. People were absolutely unaware, although many of these people were great people, we became friendly with them, but people were absolutely unaware of the sheer amount of information we had on them, where we could say in a particular day, let's pick a college in the city. Let's try primarily African-American today. We don't want to discriminate. Let's get it below. Let's get it on the south side. We don't go there as often. And we're picking Chicago State, and we're going to the second building on the campus quad, and that's where we're going to put our 16-man canvas team today. Like, that's the level of information even an NGO has. Politicians have more. So that can be used to totally define a district in ways that you would never even expect. Are we going to get a mix of African Americans and progressive whites that live in own homes and are unlikely to move? And will that be a Democratic district for X number of years? Yes. The one question I'd ask David really is, so in political science, there's a common assumption there often are very simple solutions to things. There's a half-joking Israeli-Palestinian peace plan that's been labeled cut the sand in half for as long as I've seen people present it in conferences. I back it, I suppose. The same thing here. Many political scientists would say, well, what we need is simply districts that are drawn out as contiguous areas with the same population. So if you have a state that has 700,000 people or 7 million people in it, the most logical way to divide that state, if you're looking at congressional districts of 690,000, would be to take a map of the state and draw 10 lines down it, reflecting where people live. That's not what we do. I guess the question for David after some extensive rambling here would be, what would you do about information-based gerrymandering, data-based gerrymandering? How would you actually solve that? Would you go with the political science proposal, or do you have different proposals of your own?
I think the trouble with drawing a grid is that people just don't live in grids, except maybe in Iowa and Wyoming. So it's what works in some of those states simply doesn't work every place. What I would, what I would do, I think that single member winner take all is at the heart of so many of our problems in this country. And the plan that I like is one that's called the Fair Representation Act. It's been advanced by Congressman Don Beyer, a couple of other folks. And what he suggests is you take a state and you draw larger districts, and you can do that exactly like a grid. If you want to just go down the mid, take a state like Massachusetts, divide it into 3/3, and you have larger multi-member districts. And as a result, you are, and you vote with ranked choice voting. And if you are able to do that, suddenly you open up representational possibilities that have been completely denied to us by single member winner take all. I mean, I live here in Massachusetts. We've got a Republican governor who can win statewide, and there has not been a Republican member of Congress elected from the state since 1994. And that is because of single member winner take all. So there are the 40% of Republicans in the state that have got zero representation. There's nobody from this delegation who is espousing their interests or that they can look to and be like, that's my member of Congress who's working for me. And if you were to divide the state into 3 districts of 3 instead of a delegation of 9, you would see Democrats, Republicans, independents, all kinds of people able to get elected. And I think that if you were able to do that in Kansas as well, and in Texas, you would see different kinds of people elected who then would be incentivized to work together differently when they got to Washington or their state capitals. I think that we miss the Southern conservative Democrat. I think we miss the New England Republican in our politics, and that there are all kinds of centrists or third parties that, deserve a voice here as well. But that single member winner take all essentially locks in this a binary red versus blue, and it makes the place where these lines are chosen, it dictates outcomes and results for a decade.
That red versus blue Kool-Aid fight that we all are forced to have, and then what flavor of red is it this year? Because right now, these parties don't make any sense to me. So it's like your party moves around you and you're like, I'm a centrist also in like Will. I'll vote for a Republican or a Democrat. I'll usually vote no against legislation because I don't believe legislators know what they're doing and they don't provide the best solution. So they got to convince me. If they run on it's good for schools, I'm like, you've done that 1,000 times. So come back with a better offer. Anyhow, that's just my personal voting philosophy. I'm curious what you think about, with COVID completely destroying the normalcy of a regular census. And I know a few people who work not just temporarily, but like consistently for the census folks. They're like, we don't know how we're going to get all this done and sorted and in a way that makes any sense. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that has to impact what we're about to go through with all of this redistricting and everything else.
I think that's right. The census is where it all begins. And if you don't have an accurate count, it can affect everything else. It affects apportionment. So it's going to affect the number of member states have, and the number of member states have then affect the number of electoral college votes you end up with. And then, of course, there's all the federal funding that is triggered off of that as well, and where those dollars flow. So if we have an undercount, it could have, long lasting repercussions.
Yeah. You wrote a piece recently about Virginia, and we might be surprised at how the gerrymandering is going there. And I think that piece is on Salon. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's in that?
Yeah. Virginia just passed a bipartisan compromise on redistricting. Republicans moved it through in 2019, and Democrats agreed to it when they took over in 2020. If you're going to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot in Virginia, it's got to move through the House and Senate with the same language 2 years in a row. And the interesting thing in Virginia is that a partisan control of the House and Senate shifted after 2019. Virginia is one of those weird states that does their legislative elections in odd years. So you had to have Republicans pass it 1 year, Democrats pass it the next. Then it went to voters. And, as we all know, the legislatures that were elected in 2020 are going to dominate redistricting next year. But in Virginia, the legislatures elected in 2019 are the ones that are going to dominate redistricting. And as soon as it was clear that the Democrats were going to have that control, all of a sudden they were like, well, wait a second here.
Hold on a second.
Maybe this plan isn't as good as it could be. How about if we think about this again and talk about it a little more? And you had, a party that has, talked a good game about redistricting reform over the course of the last, few years, suddenly was saying, well, we aren't in favor of this. And you had Democratic town committees across much of the state that was mobilizing opposition to it. And it passed overwhelmingly. I think it was about 65-35 in the end. But if you think that this is always about principle, of course it's not. You had Democrats in Virginia who were more than willing to say, but trust us with these lines, and to try to make that case to their voters. I thought it was completely disingenuous and lacked integrity.
When these legislator fights, as we're just like, holy cow, look at this. How many states do you think are getting it closer to right? Like in your second book, you were like, it's getting better, but is it still getting better? And then who would you identify as being more tuned to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Will
could have asked that, but he didn't.
I think we're in for a world of hurt as we approach this next cycle. I don't think there are a lot of states that are getting it right. And I think that the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court in the Rucho versus Common Cause case a couple of years ago essentially closed the doors to, future claims of partisan gerrymandering. They called it a non-justiciable political issue. I think that is going to embolden lawmakers to embark on even more brazen gerrymanders in this next cycle without any fear that the high court is going to rein them in or provide any guardrails on the process. I think that the California Commission is probably the strongest when it comes to this. I like that they bring together Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They have to travel the state together and listen to people talk about communities of interest and kind of which communities ought to be held together. And then they have to conduct the entire process transparently in public. They have to draw every line in public. They have to write essays that justify why they put lines where they did. If they want to pass a map, they have to have super majorities of the Republicans, Democrats, and independents all have to sign off on it. So nobody can feel like two sides got together and jammed the other map down their throats. And I think that's a pretty, good process. Michigan just added a commission as well, and they're going to kind of model it that way. But there's bad commissions too. That there's a horrible commission in Arizona, for example. It's a 5-person commission, and it's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and they're appointed by politicians. And there's an independent chair, but the chair is appointed through the state appellate court personnel process. And simply by saying that phrase, I put half of your audience to sleep. Except both parties have figured out how to game. This is how important it is. both parties in Arizona have figured out how to try to game the state appellate court personnel process in order to stick a Trojan horse chair on the redistricting commission. The Democrats think Republicans did it back in 2000. Republicans are sure that the Democrats did it in 2010, and I think they're probably right. There's certainly some evidence pointing, in that direction, and so if you give these commissions are only as good as they're set up to operate and who's on them. So some of them are no solution at all, and it's not much better than just having lawmakers sitting in the basement of the Capitol with a map and a bottle of whiskey.
Yeah, one of the things that's notable to me about a lot of government solutions, and this is actually one of the reasons I tend to lean right. I want the government doing as little as possible and taking as little of my money as possible, frankly. But one of the things I notice about a lot of government solutions is that they work more poorly than almost anything smart, regular people could think up at random. I mean, if you simply picked a dozen tax-paying citizens and asked them to draw a fair map, they would do a better job than these split partisan commissions.
Amen.
David, you had a good response to this, but I still like the draw lines down from the top of the map solution. I mean, look at it, find out what each quadrant of 700,000 people is, line down from the top. You might split cities in half. You might have a district that's partially the fringe suburbs of a large city, then the surrounding agrarian area that could go red or blue. There are a lot of underlying issues here, actually. One question I do have for you, I'll do an intro, but then I want to hear what your answer is. I tend to agree that if we went to more of a European parliamentary model, which is something that you seem to be discussing with FairVote, you'd have a larger district and the top 4 individuals from that district would be seated in Congress. And that could very easily be 2 Democrats, a Republican, and a Green, for example, in a lot of districts.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business, or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
For example, in a lot of districts. Again, that would definitely produce a broader range of representation than what we have right now. One of the underlying issues that we're starting to see more pieces about recently is that there no longer, if there ever were, seem to be clear 2-party bifurcations in the USA. So we have, I'd say, 5 or 6 potential parties. You're really starting to see a growing progressive European-style left with, the obvious choices, AOC, Ilhan Omar, so on. You're also seeing a populist Orban-style right. If you look at Trump, OANN, so on down the line, I suppose I'd fall in the traditional business Republican category of the traditional Union Democratic category. You have actual outsiders like those libertarians that, annually strip down to their underwear in their convention and fight each other. That's a substantial 8% block of the population. I guess the question after all this is, what do you think we'd end up with if we implemented some sort of a fair vote proposal and we were able to break the control of partisan commissions or split partisan commissions on gerrymandering? How many American political parties do you think there'd be? Would be one question.
I think Lee Drutman's book on this is really terrific. I'm guessing that's one of the pieces you're talking about on the 2-party doom loop. And Lee is really, really smart on this. And, I think we probably have, in many ways, 4 parties in this country, right? And that the 2-party system, we have 4 main parties. And we once had a more flexible party system in that you had liberals and conservatives in both the Democrats and the Republican side, and that the parties have become more polarized and more distinct over the course of the last, several decades. And what that has done, especially, we have a system of government that is not set up for, and Lee makes this case in a more articulate way than I can, but when you have 2 diametrically opposed parties and you combine that with winner take all, our structures are not necessarily set up to succeed under those conditions. And I think that's what we are in some ways looking at right now. You have a Democratic and a Republican Party that have become much more ideologically narrow and defined. And you are putting that on top of essentially a winner-take-all system, and it leaves people out, and it forces everything to extremes. One of the problems with these gerrymandered districts in so many ways is it pushes all of the action that ought to be in a general election into a party primary. And it's, a lower turnout base affair. And so that just exacerbates the ideological purity that arises as a result. And then people come to Washington or their state capital, and we're surprised that they can't get along or, get anything done, even when there seems to be, a fairly clear path forward as far as public opinion on some things. So I think if you could, it wasn't that long ago, right, that you still had some Republicans in elected office who were to the left of some Democrats and some Democrats who were to the right of some Republicans. And those are bridge builders. Those are compromisers. And we've pushed all of those people out of office. And I think our politics has suffered as a result.
That pushing of the bridge builders out, it's like we forget about what we know about building a great statesman, and that you have to build consensus. You can talk about we're all going to get together, but when you act like the last few presidents, it just hasn't worked. We haven't gotten together. We've, if not gotten worse, we sure haven't gotten better at it. How much? If I'm sitting in Nebraska, how much does the state legislature of states that don't even border me, how much does that even matter to me? Like Texas, how does that impact someone in Nebraska? How does that impact someone in Illinois? Why does this matter so much? This is your thing. So tell me why I care 3, 4, 5, 6 states away what their state legislature makeup is and their gerrymandering practices, whether they're good or bad.
Your state's probably doing the exact same thing. So you certainly ought to care about it. But I think what this has done is that it's pushed policy to extremes that go beyond what, most people want to see. And it has insulated politicians from the ballot box, and our politicians ought to be accountable to us. And when they are in these non-competitive gerrymandered districts that they themselves have drawn from their bunkers in Columbus, Ohio, or their, secret map rooms in law firms in Madison, Wisconsin. What it does is it means that we can no longer throw the bastards out. And if we can't throw them out, then they can do whatever they want while they're there. And that affects all of us. It certainly affects us when, these states have electoral votes, and when they make it more difficult to cast ballots in states, that can affect the outcome, nationwide. We have very close elections. In 2016, the Electoral College tipped off of 80,000 votes in 3 states. This year, the Electoral College may tip off of fewer than that. It may be, if you take Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, you could be talking about 75,000 votes this time. And so the actions that those states take on questions of voting, whether left or right, are going to affect everybody nationwide.
when we create these commissions to redistrict things, you talked about California being sort of a model. Orange County is a good, that's where I live. I'm recording from the Bay, but Orange County is, pretty evenly distributed, one third left, one third right, one third middle. But there's also the wealth party, like you can get hyper blue and hyper red people to agree we don't want a damned airport near our property. So, excuse me. So how do you, and you also don't see any independent, representatives from California in Congress. So is this a problem of just not enough? Orange County has 3.5 million people. That's bigger than the populations of a number of states. Should we have smaller districts in Orange County? How do you get better representation I often feel like, I have no representation. Yeah. I emailed Katie Porter, who's my rep, twice, never got a response. And I know she's busy, but if you get a null value back, you're not my representative, you're never going to get my vote.
I think that's right. Listen, I wonder, I don't know where you guys would come down on the question of a larger house. The House has been fixed at 435 for a long time, and I certainly think that it could be time for us to be, thinking about that. I know that the response often is, it's not working. You want to add more politicians to it? I totally get that. But from a representational standpoint, the country's a lot bigger than it was, 100 years ago, and we have an awful lot of people, I think, who do not feel particularly well represented under the makeup of the current system. And, again, I think a big piece of that is winner take all. When you essentially don't count in that district, right? And I think you don't count sometimes even in a competitive district. Sometimes even in a district that is 50.1 to 49.9, then you've got 49.9% of the people unhappy. In a district that has been, packed, cracked, or stacked to go one way or the other automatically, at least overwhelmingly, the people in that district probably are behind the general party there. There's a conservative political scientist named Thomas Brunel down in Texas. I think he's at the University of Texas at Dallas. And his argument is you ought to draw super partisan districts that will please the greatest number of people, and then you ought to have the rest of them be as competitive as you can. And there's an interesting logic to that in some ways. Perhaps more people would feel pleased with the quality of their representation if you did it that way. I think that there's a lot of creative ways of thinking about this and looking at it. I think what's clear to me, at least, is that the way we are doing it now is not working.
Yeah, so a couple of comments there. I actually wouldn't favor a bigger House of Representatives, because if we're talking about doing that under the current model, where, the districts are drawn up by partisan state legislators, they're census-based, so on, you just have more politicians coming out of imperfect, gerrymandered partisan district. I actually have a quick question for each of you guys. So for Pete, when you talk about Orange County, there was a very quick discussion earlier in the show about whether sort of sophisticated forms of election interference are possible. And my understanding is that the OC is one of the places in the USA where you saw some dramatic electoral shifts after, quote unquote, ballot harvesting was legalized. So that had been a traditionally conservative region. But after the legalization of multiple ballot collection, that moved, was it entirely Democratic? Do you have any thoughts about that as a resident? Do you think that any of these techniques played a role, or is there just a shift in population, something like that?
Yeah, there are so many people in Southern California it's hard to put your finger on how things shift, just because if you look at how traffic flows, there's always 1,000 cars getting on. There's always 1,000 cars getting off. There's always 10,000 cars on the freeway. It's just hard to sort out who's where and what they are. But when I walk on the trail, and this is, qualitative, but that's the kind of guy I am, there's open but silent political discourse going on the trail. Someone will wear an RGB shirt, and there will be scowls and maybe even like light jabs. And someone will wear, an American flag face mask, and that will signal. And there will be this confrontation. So I would say, if anything, it is hotly contested, and we have serious problems to solve. But we're also a bunch of NIMBY dicks. So we can't decide. Like, the court compels us to deal with our homeless problem because we legally won't do it. So the court's like, you will put these people in these things. You will provide these things. The county will pay for it. And it's a judge that is like our mom or dad. I forget who it was last time, but we're a mess is what we are. And it's such a big place. And then you think about the other enclaves, like we have an enormous Southeast Asian enclave there, and one of the reasons why I think our stupid racist bill that we tried to pass didn't pass is because the Asian bloc came out and voted and said, this is going to hit us. We don't want to be judged. We want to be judged on our academic credentials, not on the color of our skin or some kind of ginned up, other thing. Let's compete. Let's compete like hell, but let's do it academically. So to answer your question, I haven't got the first clue. It's too big and too complicated for me to even say.
I was in a punk rock band in high school called the NIMBY Dicks, which is really ironic that you would bring that up.
I actually, for a while, was in a rap group called the 9-Inch Dicks. It was a parody of 9-Inch Nails. It was mostly black punk dudes. I later found out that Snoop Dogg had the same idea. So anyway, not something I put on the CV. But
no.
But that is a reality, and no reason to hide it. At any rate, no, the reason I asked that, I actually just Googled ballot harvesting flipped Orange County. And I mean, there's some pieces about that. They tend to lean right, but like the Wall Street Journal, let's take a look at this here. Democrats boast that ballot harvesting in Southern California flipped 7 seats, including all 4 seats in Orange County. I'd have to read the piece. I'd have to look at the stats underlying it. But David, do you have any thoughts on that, on any of this stuff that's being added to elections? Like, should ballot harvesting be legal? Should it be illegal? What's your take? Is the term ballot harvesting valid?
I think that the term certainly is well designed to make it look like you're, growing ballots in your backyard. When, that's
growing
not
them in local housing projects, my God.
Listen, as part of this new book, I spent a lot of time on Navajo land in Arizona and in Utah. And when you talk about ballot harvesting, I think you have to think about communities where their access to the post office or access to the ballot box is not the same as it is for you and I. And San Juan County in southeastern Utah is the size of New Jersey, and the Navajo land there has got 3 post offices. And I mean, I drove it all and I saw them, and they're, hours apart on roads that are largely impassable, and people may go get their mail once a month. And if you are 75 years old, you're probably not making the trip. Somebody's going up and getting your mail for you, bringing it back. So should it be criminalized for your ballot to be returned by a family member or a community member? I don't think so. And the trouble is, a lot of these state legislatures are more than willing to pass laws that they know are targeting certain communities harder than others. There was a lawsuit in Arizona in which a lot of the evidence came out about how specifically the state legislature there was, passing these ballot harvesting laws in order to, target, and that they knew disproportionately targeted Native American land. So, if you're going to do vote by mail in Utah, you have to figure out how to make it accessible for everybody. If you're in Orange County and there's a mailbox on every corner, I think perhaps you could be able to, drop your own ballot in the mail by yourself, and that removes, I have heard stories from friends in California working on campaigns, and someone comes, walking into the room carrying a bucket of ballots that they've collected through their political activity. Is there any fraud in it? I don't know.
Filled out in front of them. Yeah,
I have no idea. But does that lend confidence to the process? It doesn't really lend confidence to the process to me. No.
I live in a neighborhood that's transitioning from very elderly to very young. And there are a lot of people, and then in general, in Orange County, Riverside, there are a lot of places where there are folks who are retired and living in a home or whatever. So it would be easy to be disingenuous with that. And I think you could, in theory, and I know as I say this, I'm disagreeing with myself, but you could, in theory, do a bipartisan, like, hey, you and I, like vote counters, like we will go together. We will make sure that there's no shenanigans. We'll both sign off. You could do that. I think the bigger problem, this goes to my experience of being on the ground, is you and I, David, we could go to Navajo land and we could ask simple questions like, what was the last thing the government did for you? And they'll spit or laugh in our face, so they might be enfranchised, but are they? The post office doesn't even come to them. And I know Will say post office, one of the big reasons why we established a democracy and actually had a country that did things. We know these things. So the enfranchisement is also kind of a bogus word. Yes, you got to vote, but you're at the end of a process, and you show me.
Well, kind of filling up the gap as we wait for Pete to come back. I think I tend to be a fan, and this goes into the coronavirus fight as well. I tend to be a fan of federal localized solutions. I don't think anyone really has an objection to some ballot collection on Indian federal land. The issue is, reading through that journal piece just now, ballot harvesting is legal in Encino. So I personally don't think that there's any particular reason that in most of these areas you should be able to round up 50 ballots from other individuals and deliver them. And to some extent, this distinction between can you prove it and is it likely going on? Again, I come from a very urban background, come from a union family. I would 100% guarantee that in urban areas where ballot harvesting is legal, there's a fairly significant amount of untraceable voter fraud. The other argument would be essentially that people are simply collecting 100 ballots. They're not at all influencing how people vote. They are not at all filling in ballots themselves, and they are simply delivering these as good Samaritans. And that seems somewhat implausible. So I guess my comment would be that there are the argument generally from the left is there's a lot of voter suppression going on, and the right tends to sort of chortle at that. The argument on the right is often there's probably some untraceable voter fraud going on. The left tends to sort of chortle at that. I think that both are, in at least situational context, pretty valid. I'd be interested in how many native tribal elders have a current valid ID, for example. So these are real questions. And whenever possible, I favor regional or statewide solutions. But yeah, when you're your buddy was working for a campaign and someone walked in with a tub of votes, I would be very, very skeptical that all of those were sort of correctly, properly obtained and delivered without any editing whatsoever. That almost beggars belief. So whenever possible, I would limit practices like this. And that's really it. I think that a lot of the things so I haven't asked a lot of sort of invasive questions during this particular podcast, because a lot of the things that you're saying, there's a great deal of gerrymandering. It's bipartisan. It occurs across states. They're simply not contested in my field. So there's personal politics, and then there's sort of political science. The question really is what to do about that. But whenever possible, I favor making both obtaining something like ID and voting as easy as possible on the one hand, and also restricting things that are obviously likely to bias that process on the other. So that is my kind of one piece of input there. I see Pete is back with us.
Yes, hello, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for taking over the show for me. I appreciate it. I wanted to mention that you're a senior fellow at FairVote too. Before we get too late in the show, do you want to talk about your work there at all, or do you want to respond to Will's last comment?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think FairVote works, a lot on questions of ranked choice voting, on the Fair Representation Act, nonpartisan issues, trying to make electoral reforms that give everybody more choice and more voice in their elections. No, I think I agree with a lot of what Will just said. Sorry, I'm fighting off a cold here today. And I would say this, I went out to North Dakota on this book as well, and I did some reporting out on Indian land there as well. And what's amazing about North Dakota is it's the one state in the nation that does not require voter registration. They allow you simply to show up and vote because they figure they've known you since kindergarten anyway. And the Pew Research Center, year after year says North Dakota has the best election administration in the country. So, something's working for them. Their a state-based approach was working just fine. And 2013, they start talking about voter ID bills. And it's kind of interesting that you don't have to do voter registration, but they want a voter ID. And what they came up with was you've got to have a voter ID that has a street address. And the trouble with that is all of that native land doesn't have street addresses. So even if you have a valid ID, if you are living, at Standing Rock or any of the other, and Native Americans are the largest minority group in North Dakota. So that's an awful lot of people. And so this was an attempt to use voter ID as a really direct means of making it harder for specific people to vote in that state. Is it a coincidence that these efforts start in 2013 after the native vote helps put Heidi Heitkamp over the top in a U.S. Senate race there? Probably not. So I think that we all want to have safe and secure elections that are free of fraud, and we want to be sure that the person casting the vote is the person who is supposed to be casting that vote. But I think we also have to make sure that the means by which we're doing that also doesn't make it more difficult for people to be casting those ballots. And too often we have seen those efforts kind of head into the precise partisan realm. I'm the journalist who found Thomas Hoffler's secret files, and Hoffler was kind of the master Republican redistricting guy. And I came into, tens of thousands of his documents. And the amazing thing about going through them, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier, is the precision of the data. And among the things that I found in Hoffler's hard drive was this huge spreadsheet in which he had listed the names and addresses of every college student in the state, all of which could be sorted by race, and all of which was also sorted by whether or not these people were registered to vote, and then whether they had a necessary driver's license. And what you had was North Carolina's legislature over that period of time had enacted a bill that said you had to have a driver's license if you wanted to vote. So they were drawing district lines specifically looking to see which people not only were registered, but which people would actually be able to show up and vote. And that just seems to me to be, crossing so many lines at once that it ought to be, representative.
Sorry. I think that one very quick comment I would make, I wouldn't say that either party has particularly better ethics than the other. That's almost an irrelevant philosophical debate when you're talking about sort of bare knuckle politics. My impression is that the Democrats in general want more votes almost by any means necessary, and the Republicans want fewer votes by any means necessary. If I were attempting to regulate a voting system, my goal would be eliminating the excesses of both parties on those two sides. So I personally would stringently restrict ballot harvesting. There might perhaps, as you've noted, be exceptions for tribal lands or something like this. I would definitely make sure that every county is vetting the motor voter rolls, for example. Cameras in place, bipartisan observers for the residuals of sort of the union slate process we used to see in Chicago. Then what would I do for the rights antics? I mean, you'd have to look at the number of voting machines available in poor as versus wealthy areas. You'd have to have an ID that's valid. You don't need your current, there's some of the things that I've been a college student until recently. Some of the stuff that goes on approaches poll test levels. So, I mean, the attempt to unfairly extend the vote. I mean, in Chicago at one point, we were talking about putting polling places in the Cook County Jail. I'm sure that you could argue that there'd be some caveat on who's voting there. In general, my default would be maybe not. But both that, on the other hand, and the Republican attempts to restrict the vote are very problematic. That's one sentence. Now, I actually have to go for a radio interview in a couple of minutes, but I'll leave with one question actually for David that I'm very interested in, and I'll probably watch on the podcast later. What would you do to improve the U.S. electoral system within our current model? I mean, I've followed a bit of what you're doing with FairVote. I think it's a good idea. But within the current system, what would you do if it is two-party, winner take all? How would you improve our model? I mean, would you consider term limits, public financing of elections again? What would you do within the constraints we have?
I think you've got to begin with, independent redistricting. I think you've got to find a way to not have politicians drawing their own lines and choosing their own voters. That to me is such an obvious conflict of interest that, not only to me, but we are essentially the only modern democracy in the world that allows it. It has to stop. Within the, I think we need, genuine campaign finance reform. I think, as far as within our current system, I think ranked choice voting is you are seeing this come out across the nation. I think you just had a really interesting reform passed in Alaska the other day statewide that is going to eliminate closed party primaries in Alaska. You're going to have one big primary, and the top four people coming out of that are going to head on to a fall election with ranked choice voting. And I think that's a really interesting, elegant idea to kind of get around the problem we have with closed party primaries producing two extreme candidates, and you get a choice of far left or far right in November, and depending on what kind of district you live in, it might not be any choice at all. If you can have a wide open election in which four people with the most votes move on, and then you have a really kind of, a robust campaign, and the winner has to have 50% of the vote. So a ranked choice voting functions as an instant runoff to ensure that you don't have somebody with 28% of the vote as a plurality winner representing everybody. You get the person that the greatest number of people can agree on. That seems to me to be a pretty elegant solution.
All right, gotta go.
Bye, Will. Yeah, I agree. Look, we always want state of the art things. Our voting, I would say, is not state of the art.
No.
How we hold ourselves accountable is not state of the art. Our management of parties is not state of the art. We have a lot of work we can do in general. And also, just to say your thing, like, we should be having a discussion. And just for the audience, I am not saying court packing, but we have not changed the size of the Supreme Court in 100 plus years. And they're not hearing, have an opportunity to hear less cases. There are more people. There are more gray areas to sort out. I actually like what Donald Trump did and said, these are the justices I'm going to pick from. I think you could do something like that bipartisan and just have the Senate and the president and whatever, someone else, maybe the speaker, make a list. Like, these are the people that we would all agree we could pick from, and then rotate the court. Like, you don't know which 9 you're going to get. You can do some kind of randomized number thing. But we're also not hearing enough cases from these guys. There's just no way. I think they should be hearing. I'm not trying to say that they have to hear everything. They're certainly allowed to say, this isn't for us. You guys, you're good. Go back. But, we have to adapt to the size of our country, 330 million people. And for the most part, I would say, and I think you'll agree with me on this, David, we're not genuinely being represented,
No. I think that's right. And I think that there's a lot of things we could do to make the court function better and to make the court confirmation process function better. If we knew that every president got 2 picks and that everybody served an 18-year term and that they sort of cycled through, you would take all the sting out of these fights, right? Because when you elected a president, you would know that it came with, 2 picks, and we wouldn't have to tie ourselves up in knots over this. You would know what the consequences were, and it wouldn't matter which party controlled the Senate. You wouldn't have these disingenuous battles. And that would be, I like the idea of having a wider number, and you don't know which 9 are going to be drawn for any given case. It just seems like common sense. What we have is, if we were designing this system now, you would never come up with these, wild Rube Goldberg contraptions.
The other thing I would like to see,
because no,
they're not
fundamentally not serving us well, and we can change them. It's not written in stone. We the people can change these systems and modernize them in order to represent ourselves adequately and fairly and functionally.
Anybody who listens to the show knows that I always say, don't just vote. Like, that's the least you can do. Like, if you want to value your rights, go get involved, go volunteer. You don't have to run for office. You can, you can do a lot. You can write a research paper, and do something like you did. Look how your career has evolved from when you took on the story that no one wanted to write about gerrymandering. We can all do something. It doesn't have to be partisan driven. I'm curious of your thoughts on this. So one of the innovations I'm trying to think about is we're so good at measuring so many things with software and that kind of thing. I would love to see, I don't know if you're aware of how chess players are evaluated, but it's a thing called the ELO rating. And so I would like to see an ELO rating for legislators, and you could, build a body of KPIs that you want to see. And it's like, hey, if you fall below this point, you're out. You get time to get above a certain point, and then if you're not, then you're going to get rotated out of the House or out of the Senate because, your judgment is proving to be bad. Because we never look back and say, was that bad policy? Occasionally we use that to win an election, but was this good policy? No, actually it was wrong. Or, hey, you said we were going to fund schools, right, and it turned out we defunded the old budget and just swapped. That didn't work.
There need to be some consequences, I think, what you're saying. And elections ideally serve as consequences, except that they're not.
They're not, yeah.
From any number of problems, whether it's problems inside the parties, whether it's redistricting, whether it's, any number of things, our elections are not working to produce representatives who work for us and are accountable to us, who we feel we can change if we want to. The leadership of the Democratic Party, they're all in their 80s. You know, they reelected the entire leadership of the party today. I think all three of them are over 80 years old. I mean, it's you know, there's a need for new voices. There's a need for change. And when the system can't produce any of that, no wonder so many of us are so frustrated.
And you said earlier, and I wanted to touch on this if you've got time, but the campaign finance thing. Why am I seeing ads for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? She is not my representative. She does not live in my state. She doesn't live in my half of the country.
Well, she's fundraising off of all of the, you know, wealthy Democrats in Orange County. You know, I mean, it's the same reason why I watched the news here and I saw, you know, a million ads for Amy McGrath.
Right.
I mean, Amy McGrath is not running to be the U.S. senator from Massachusetts. Why is she running ads on my cable TV system? Well, it's because she knows that there's, you know, a lot of lefties up here who don't like Mitch McConnell, and she's thinking, you know, I can get some bucks off of them.
Yeah.
You know, it's a broken system.
Why is Michael Bloomberg buying his way into a presidency, bypassing laws when they don't let Tulsi Gabbard get in legitimately when she had the numbers? And then why is he allowed to send $100 million down to Florida to flip the election? Like, that seems criminal to me. You know, I don't know what the answer is. Maybe you just put all the money goes in one big bucket. You draw your ticket out, and that's how much you get. You know,
I mean, before Citizens United, before Buckley v. Vallejo, we did not consider money to be speech. And, and the idea that money is speech, and then the idea that anybody with a super PAC and enough dark money that's willing to light it on fire by turning it into negative ads for months on months can do so and influence our elections is a disaster for democracy.
Yeah, and you reach a point when you're as wealthy as Michael Bloomberg or anybody, you know, who's at that level. Like I one day did the math and tried to figure out how many people Jeff Bezos would have to hire to find charities, to write checks, to give his money. And I couldn't find a number that made any sense because he just makes that much money. So for Michael to blow $100 million, it's going to be right back in his pocket, like instantly, you know?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's interest, right? I mean, you know, it's not, it's, you know, it's not principle.
Right.
These people, you know, for Bloomberg or for Sheldon Adelson or for Soros, no matter which side of this you are on, the amount, you know, Steyer or whoever it is, the amount of money that they are contributing to the process is a rounding error. You know, these are people who could lose all of their wallets and it wouldn't affect them, you know, one bit.
Yeah. Well, listen, I appreciate you coming on and helping us continue to understand this crazy election. You know, no matter what, I'd like to say, picking the lesser of two evils is still picking evil. It'd be great to have better candidates.
And a process that didn't force you to choose between a binary, a good or evil.
I easily could have voted for Andrew Yang without holding my nose. I didn't particularly agree with Tulsi Gabbard, but I have faith that she would do her damnedest to do her damnedest. And that's all I can really ask for at the presidential level. It doesn't have to be, you know, my personal person, you know, but I could have done that easily. And I'll just be honest, I don't think it was ever a possibility because that party has shown that it's not going to allow the people to pick its candidate.
Listen, you know? I mean, that's the beauty of ranked choice voting there as well. You know, whenever you've got 24 candidates, you're going to have a winner with 25% of the vote. And that is one of the real flaws in our politics right now. We have these huge fields of candidates and you end up with winners that, you know, nobody really wants.
Yeah. Well, listen, man, I appreciate you coming on. Next time you want to come back or write a book, whatever, let's do it again.
Oh, it's a pleasure. You got it. Thanks for having me.